On today's episode, number 70, I speak with Dr. Amy Collier about not yet-ness. Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential. Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. This is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to increase our personal productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. Today on episode 60 of Teaching in Higher Ed, Dr. Amy Collier joins me to talk about not Yet-Ness. She is the Associate Provost for Digital Learning in the Office of the Provost at Middlebury College. And that's a recent transition that she made. She'll tell us a little bit about that later on. She, prior to that, was at Stanford and most recently was the Director of Digital Learning Initiatives in the Office of the Vice Provost for Online Learning. Amy, welcome to Teaching in Higher Ed.
Hi, Bonnie. Thank you.
I noticed on your Twitter profile, you said that you are very nerdy and often geeky, and I'm curious how you distinguish between those two things.
Oh, so I think this is just my definition. I don't claim that this is correct. I think that nerdy for me is kind of the book learning, knowing theorists and certain books that you read in grad school. Geeky for me is my husband. So somebody who likes Star Wars and Star Trek. Who's into sci-fi, which, geeky is actually quite popular these days. So I begrudgingly say that I'm not as geeky as I'd like to be because it's very in right now.
And one of the other things you mentioned is that you enjoy shenanigans. Are there any that you care to admit to on today's podcast?
Let's see. A safe one might be karaoke. Let's go with that. I enjoy, especially at conferences. I have wonderful colleagues who I see at conferences, and occasionally we like to indulge in some singing and occasionally some dancing.
You also mentioned you like to sing the blues. Have you ever heard John Mayer on his live album do Every Day I Have the Blues?
I have. He tries to channel a bit of Eric Clapton, who I favor more than I do John Mayer. But my favorite blues artist is actually Stevie Ray Vaughan. My son is named after Stevie Ray Vaughan, and he was born on B.B. King's birthday. He's a blues kid all the way around.
And I have lots and lots of songs from back in the days when we actually bought CDs. The thing is, what would be the one album or maybe even just the one song I should absolutely go and listen to after we hang up the phone about from Stevie Ray Vaughan?
Oh, goodness.
Probably too hard.
Gosh. I would say, Mary Had a Little Lamb is always just super fun. And it's lively and it's hilarious and it's just, you can tell he's having a great time. And it's so easy to digest. It's a great intro into Stevie Ray Vaughan. And there's some great documentaries about him. So if you like what you hear, he had a tormented life. And so it's very interesting to watch. He died too young.
You studied for your PhD family studies, and that's something I don't know a lot about. Could you share how you got interested in that and also what it was like studying that for your doctorate?
Family studies is kind of a sociology of the family, kind of mixture of sociology and psychology and education. It looks at the system, the family system, and it defines that pretty broadly. It doesn't kind of dictate what a family looks like necessarily. And it looks at that the family system interacting with other systems like education systems and government systems and healthcare systems and things like that, and looks at how those dynamics are all interrelated. I got into the field mostly because I decided after declaring myself as a music major that I actually wasn't cut out to be a music major, and then after declaring myself as I think it was English or communication major, I wasn't really cut out for that either. And I found family studies, which was an interdisciplinary program. It had psychology and economics and sociology and all these different fields in it. And I thought, wow, that sounds just interesting enough for someone who gets 40 like I do. I started the program and just fell in love with it. I loved the theory building that we do in it. I loved the kind of inclusive examination of the family. I loved the participatory action research. I at first wanted to get into advocacy. I thought I would go be an advocate for different kinds of policies that were friendly for different kinds of families. but found education and went in that direction instead.
You said that you named your son after Stevie Ray Vaughan, but then I didn't. Is your son's name Stevie? Is that correct?
It's actually Vaughn.
Oh, his name is Vaughn. Sorry if I missed that.
Yeah.
Tell me about Vaughn.
No, it's okay.
Tell me about Vaughn playing with the Lego bricks and how that really connected you with the thought of how people learn.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you learn a lot from parenting about, learning and certainly, in my studies, we studied parenting, we studied child development. So, kind of from my nerdy side, from my book side of things, I knew that play and that creative engagement was important to people's learning, but I hadn't really witnessed it, very, very closely. But, as you watch your child growing up, you see things happening and you kind of start to wonder why or wonder what's happening inside of them. And so I'd begun to think about his education and broader education as, what are we trying to do here? And why do we keep seeing solutions and challenges thrown towards education that really paint education in this very short-sighted kind of limited light? And so I was preparing to do a talk on Yet-Ness, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And I decided just to kind of play with my son and see what happened when I gave him a couple different Lego sets. So what I did is I gave him one Lego set, and I told him I had him pick out two of the exact same Lego sets. So the Lego sets were the same. I had him build one set with the instructions, following the instructions. And I have a video on my blog, so people can go look at these two videos of him building these Lego sets. You'll see in the video that when he's building according to the rules, he's following the instructions, and, he's very concentrated because these instructions are, if you've ever built Legos, sometimes quite complex. So he builds and, he accomplishes what he set out to do. And then I gave him the exact same set, the other one that was unbuilt, and I said, now just build it however you want. And he said, really? However I want? I said, yeah, just however you want. Don't worry about the instructions. And immediately as he started building, he went to these creative places. He started putting together things that looked nothing like the original set. And he played the whole time. You could see his enjoyment in the video. It's so palpable. There's no audio in the video, but you can still see he's making sounds. He's talking the whole time. He's just having a blast. And ever since, I watch him play with Lego still. And, he'll occasionally build the set as it is supposed to be the very first time. But then from then on out, it's mayhem. It's whatever he wants to do. And that's the great thing about Legos is it gives kids these tools that don't have to be built a certain way. And, when you start to kind of take that and turn it into thinking about learning more broadly, what I love is that when you kind of work with students to give them bricks, to give them tools and spaces and opportunities to kind of do do something related to what you're talking about in class, but that they can kind of take it and build things that are their own and do certain creative ways that you might not have predicted, you'll see, I think, a lot of joy and a lot of excitement and a lot of play when that happens. And that's one of the things that I think is something we should strive to achieve as educators, is to give students that space to play.
As I told you about over email, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. You actually recently moved jobs, so I had to be patient and wait until you settled in, although I don't think you're probably ever likely to be too settled of a person. I think you like the adventure of it all. But I was not as nervous today as I usually am because you and I I've discovered things in common, and it helps me feel more comfortable. Two of those things we have in common. One is our love of teaching and just passion and thinking about that and reflecting. And then the second one is perhaps unexpected by some of our listeners, and that is that Jazzercise has connected us. You teach Jazzercise classes, and I take them, and I have been for many moons. In fact, my mother took the first Jazzercise classes from Judy Missett, who's the founder. And my brother and I would go to the junior high school where she would teach, and we would kind of toll around there while mom took her class. And then as I got older, I took the junior Jazzercise and got old enough to do it. So tell me about your interest in Jazzercise and what parallels you see between it and your love of teaching and how people learn.
I found Jazzercise through a friend, my best friend at the time I was living in Texas, and she joined and she just fell in love with it. And I I just recently had my son, and I said, well, I'll go. And I tried it one time, and I was like, not for me. I felt awkward. I felt like I had no dance background. I felt like, maybe this just wasn't going to be for me. Eventually I decided, you know what, for my health and because my best friend goes, I'm going to try it again. And for some reason, whatever it was, at that moment, at that time in my life, it just clicked. And I think it was partly because my state of mind had changed over time. Right after having my son, I actually had a little bit of postpartum depression. And coming out of that, I started to see opportunities for joy in my life differently. And this became one of those opportunities for joy in my life. And dance has become, I think, since then, a place where I find freedom and I find clarity and I find help, of course, because this is a health program. Just immediately, as soon as I started taking classes with this different frame of mind, within, a couple of classes, one of the teachers came up to me and she goes, you move well and you seem to really love this. You should try to be an instructor. And at the time I was starting to apply and interview for the job at Stanford that I had before I came to Middlebury. I thought, well, I'm about to move. Might be something to try. And so I moved out to California. I had lots of free time on my hands because my husband and son had not moved out with me at the time. I tried out. And what I love about it, in addition to just the program, is a wonderful program. And that dance is something that I find something that connects us as humans, something that, at least for me, is a place of immense joy. I find that I love the teaching of it. I love to connect with people at all different kinds of fitness levels and work with them to find that joy in their own way. And I think this parallels kind of how I think about teaching too, and that, for me, coming into the classroom from a place of acceptance of, each of the people who's coming into this classroom comes from a different background, has a diverse experience, in this case with dance, has maybe some baggage around dance. Some people have fear, some people have a huge background, and so they come in with a lot of confidence. In the same way that I would see a student coming into my class on some educational topic, they come in with different backgrounds, and finding out what drives them, what gets them excited, what keeps them coming back, starting from where they are and helping them to find their own voice or their own step, their own way of improvising. To me, that's what education is about. To me, that's where I find the most joy. And I think that I've been able to replicate in my Jazzercise classroom the way I approach teaching in general. Mm. And because of that, I think I developed strong relationships with my students. I feel like my classroom is a community rather than just a place where I go in and do a job. And so I think that there's a really nice parallel between my love of Jazzercise and what I do and the way I approach teaching and learning more broadly.
How do you define not yet-ness, and when did this phrase first enter into your mind?
So not yet-ness is a term that Jen Ross and I, Jen Ross is at the University of Edinburgh. She's a senior lecturer there. She and I met at a conference a few years ago and just really hit it off. We've become great colleagues, and we worked together on several projects. And we were asked a few years ago to do a presentation at a conference, a keynote at a conference, and it was on kind of mess in online learning. And the idea was for us to kind of push back on some of the ways in which we approach online learning, which is to put really rigid structures on top of it, whether it's using rubrics to design a course or to use a heavy-handed backward design process that doesn't allow for some creativity, for some exploration, both on the part of the faculty and the students. And so our keynote was on kind of bringing mess and embracing mess into online environments to allow for different kinds of learner experiences and outcomes to emerge. And the notion of emergence was one that we had been playing with. We kind of ran into it through complexity theory. Complexity theory has this notion of emergence, and it just kind of resonated for us. Kind of creating the conditions for emergence was something that we felt like was where we wanted to talk about and do additional research on. After the presentation, we had the chance to then write kind of a book chapter for a book that George Feliciano is the editor for. And it was, again, on kind of this idea of mess and online education. And as we were writing about it, we came across the original, the first edition of this book, in which George Vosjanos had written an introduction where he talked about that emerging technologies. He kind of explores the notion of emerging, what does emerging technologies mean? And he writes about how emerging technologies satisfy two not yet conditions. One is that they're not yet fully kind of understood, that they're, that how they're used and what they're intended to be is not totally defined yet, and that they're not yet fully researched. That is, that we don't really fully understand how to assess those environments or those tools, whatever the emerging technology is. And we really latched on to this idea and thought about the notion of not yetness. Because on the one hand, while we're talking about emerging technologies in this case as being kind of as not yet this and not yet that, what we love the idea is kind of living in that not yetness, about kind of instead of using not yetness as just a means to an end, actually not yetness as an end itself, in that when you embrace not yetness, you're kind of allowing for emergence. You're creating space for things to continue to evolve and develop as, say, a student grows and develops through learning certain things, or when you're designing a course, creating space that is not fully defined and doesn't have maybe a specific purpose, and that's okay, and embracing that, and talking to the students about, this is a space that I put here, and I don't really know what to do with it. Let's figure this out together. So we love this idea of kind of embracing that yetness as a place where we can see things emerge, where we can give people space to try new things without pressures of checklists and rubrics, and everything has to be just perfect before it launches. And I think this is the reason it's kind of resonated with people, is that so many of the technologies we see and so many of the designs that people talk about today in terms of online and digital learning are very kind of overly defined, like a backwards and addy design process is, set the exact expectations for what will happen and the exact place where students will get to, and set the expectations for how students will get there. And those are all, they're lovely ideas in theory, I think, but they don't leave a lot of space for, improvisation, as you were saying before, of creativity and play and discovery and awe. And I can't help but think that those are parts of education that we actually really like. And so by not creating space for those things, we end up kind of just creating this mechanistic approach to education rather than something that feels more human and more responsive to our humanity. So that's kind of the notion of not yetness that we've been working with. And, what's great about it as a concept is that, a lot of people have taken it to very different places to talk about not yetness in faculty development, to talk about not yetness in a variety of contexts. And I think it's a lovely way to frame an embracing of emergence as a place where we can be human and find joy in the work that we do.
You earned your PhD in an interdisciplinary discipline. That sounds really redundant. Mm-hmm. And you also, of course, have worked across many disciplines in coaching and supporting faculty. What are a few examples that come to mind of whether it's emergence in different disciplines or whether it's not yetness or just messiness in online education? What are some stories that come to mind?
One of the things that comes to mind when I think about not yetness and the notion of interdisciplinarity is interdisciplinarity is the idea that so much of our curriculum, even that word is kind of a funny one, and so much of the things we do in education are kind of bound by disciplines, right? That, disciplines are the way in which we structure things, and they guide students through a particular path. And where I've seen the most kind of creativity and exploration is where students are allowed to kind of transverse between different paths because of interest, because of things that really motivate them. So, without thinking about technology, I can think of programs where students have gotten really involved in social issues, right? And so instead of, just taking biology, maybe I'm actually in some kind of program or some kind of interdisciplinary thing that allows me to take courses related to social issues from a variety of different stances or from a variety of different perspectives. And what that does is it allows me to get a better, kind of a more holistic view of a phenomenon. Maybe if I'm studying poverty or I'm really interested in alleviating poverty, seeing it from a biological lens, seeing poverty from a social lens, seeing poverty from a humanistic lens, all of those help me to better understand the issue and to be creative about how I approach looking for solutions or engaging other humans in solutions. And that cross-disciplinarity really gives you the ability to work across methodologies, across theoretical lenses, in a way that I think is really important. When I think about that, kind of facilitated by technology, I think of things like domain of one's own, which, is really just, it's a place where it's more centered around an individual, but an individual can connect to broader communities, say a community about social issues that I'm interested in, through their own domain, and stay with that community and interact with that community in a flexible way, independent of what kind of program they're in. So, the example that I use on my blog when I talk about not yetness and in this case kind of interdisciplinarity is DS 106, which is a digital storytelling course that was done several years ago by Jim Groom and some other folks at the time at University of Mary Washington. And digital storytelling is a topic that you can approach from a number of different lenses, from the humanistic, which I think was kind of the original framing of it, but you can approach it from psychology or from a lot of different lenses. And the space and the ways in which students could interact with it were facilitated by the fact that they had this flexible infrastructure that they could, host things to and share their perspective and synthesize perspectives and reflect on perspectives, while also connecting to a community that in an ongoing way was having discussions about this topic. So I guess that's how I would see the relationship between not yetness and, an example like the domain of one's own and this notion of interdisciplinarity.
It's interesting to talk to people almost every week, sometimes twice a week, about teaching in higher ed. There's so many, I just love the diversity of conversations we've had. And when Jesse Stommel was on, he talked about teaching with Twitter, among other things, and he was sharing about, and I just felt this tension to stop wanting to track it all. And I want to have there be perfect check boxes and know to what extent people participated. And those are the kinds of things. And I know this from online forums, which I no longer use at all because I find them to be not helpful to the learning process. But when we tell people, for example, go to 3 different students' messages and reply to their messages, and that's how we decide that you check the box for that week. And I get those kinds of tensions, but Twitter just opened up this whole box because there's not a nice little tidy box of how to track that sort of thing on any level. And then last week's conversation, she was talking about that her students, and these are Yale students, I can't even imagine how much more this is true for my students, that they needed some kind of a reward to give their group answer and to have that little bit of motivation. Where do you see this tension between me wanting to track things and have there be accountability, and yet can it go too far in the messiness direction? What would be your thoughts on that? I'm not sure I'm asking a very good question, but hopefully I've sparked something in you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's a question that, often when we talk about not yetness, this is one of the questions that comes up, particularly, say a faculty member might say something along the lines of, yes, not yetness is appealing to me, but the way I get rewarded as a faculty member is by my students achieving specific goals that maybe my department has outlined for me. And if I can't demonstrate in a really tangible way to, whoever's looking at this, my administrator or whoever, that my students have achieved these particular specific goals, I'm in trouble. This does not work for me. And I think that you're right that, there is a tension between the expectations, even that students bring, but the expectations that we have about what an education might look like and what are the telltale signs of a quote unquote good education, and messiness and the kind of exploration that we were just talking about. And clearly there is no right answer, but I will propose a couple of things. I think one of the good things, one of the fruitful things about these conversations we've been having about not yetness is when they raise these questions, one of the following responses, and something that Jen Ross has really tried to tackle, is, what if our methods for understanding evidence of learning are insufficient? And because of that, even if we try to apply them and say, well, we need to meet these because, we need evidence of learning, really they're just, as you said, kind of check marks. They're not totally evidence of learning. And so I think, what this raises is a question of how do we better understand what it means to learn and what that looks like and how diverse it can look like? And what are the methods that we should be evolving and exploring alongside our teaching methods to improve our understanding, to improve our assessment? And I use assessment kind of realizing that it's a problematic word here, so that we can understand and the students themselves can understand what progress has been made, and that students can feel motivated to be working towards something, because sometimes that checklist gives them something very concrete to work towards, and even if they don't really get much out of the process of checking those boxes, they're checking the boxes, and that's motivating for a lot of students. So I guess what I would say is that one of the conversations we should be having is, how do we evolve the ways in which we understand what learning is? And my concern, and this is something I talked about in my keynote with Jesse Farmore recently, my concern is that the pendulum has kind of swung towards the kind of uber accountability side of things, where, the ways in which we define learning are, like you said, the kind of check boxes, the rubrics learning outcomes, the, gold standard research, which is blind, empirical research that gives us these very clear answers about, can we predict when the student will drop out, and can we determine what is a student's knowledge state, at a certain point in time. And so that kind of thinking does not really mesh well with the notion of kind of messiness and not yetness, and that tension is definitely there. So can we evolve our understanding and our thinking about the methods by which we have evidence of learning, and even that word evidence has become problematic. Jen Ross has a paper coming out about this where she talks about speculative methods, and she would be much more prepared to talk about this than I am, but she talks about embracing methods of understanding that give us room to explore various ways in which learning is done and demonstrated and shared and understood and motivated. And I think that's a pretty exciting area to push towards. Can there be too much mess? Hard to say. One of the questions that I have been struggling with, and one that I don't have any answers for, but I'll just throw it out there because I would love to get discussions about this going, in addition to discussions about kind of the assessment side of things, is how, when you embrace not yetness in your classes, for which students does that work best? For which students will that really be an exciting proposition and a place where they can jump off from and do really exciting things? And for which students might that be scary, and maybe not scary in the sense of just it frightens them, but it's good frightening, but more like it could cause some kind of disequilibrium that is unsafe in terms of their successful participation in the educational experience. And I don't know the answer to that. That's certainly a question that I've been talking with Sean Michael Morris and Jesse Stommel and others about. Does not yetness favor a certain kind of student, or a student with a particular background, or a student with particular preparation? And if we embrace it, are we creating a situation where we're furthering inequities in our classes? Are we creating a situation where some students will just really, really struggle in a completely unproductive and problematic way? I don't know, but that's something that, again, what I love about this concept is it gives us room and an opportunity for reflection to ask those questions of ourselves, to be critical about our own pedagogy. I don't know that we do that enough, and I don't even think there's enough space for us to do that in the work that we do. And it's often not safe for faculty and teachers to spend time being critical about their own pedagogy, and not critical in the sense of just self-evaluation, but critical in the sense of thinking about inequities, thinking about who is in power, who gets left behind, those kinds of things. So these are all really important questions to ask, and ones that I hope we continue to discuss.
What have I not asked you about not yetness that we should be sure and mention before we go on to the recommendation segment?
The one thing I would say, and this relates to kind of the overall conversation that we've had around kind of dance and choreography and improvisation and not yetness, it's really just a question that I have, and one that you'll probably see on my blog in the very near future, that I've just been wrestling with and trying to think about. And that's kind of the notion of embodiment. Jen and I also explored this in an upcoming chapter that we have about ness and not yetness. We talk about the embodiment of online teachers, and even embodiment in the classroom, I think, is something that we've kind of not explored enough, and how that relates to not yetness. In some ways, the concept itself is not yet in my mind, so maybe that's part of the issue. But I guess it's just a question that I want to throw out there and encourage conversation about. And like I said, I'll be writing about it soon, because I really want to think about embodiment as a fruitful area of discussion for thinking about relationships of power, relationships of learning. I'm reminded where Bell Hooks in her book Teaching to Transgress talks about embodiment. When you ignore the body in the classroom, and the physical body in the classroom, you often kind of ignore the things that make us who we are, and therefore you kind of privilege. I think it was Audrey Waters who says you privilege the mind over the body, and how that's a problematic thing to do, because the body is very much part of who we are and the experiences that we have and the things that we bring to our learning processes. So embodiment is something that I'm itching to explore, and I would love to have collaborators. I'm sure Jen would too on this topic. And in some ways it relates to my interest in dance, because in many ways I've been building a relationship with a professor here at Middlebury who's a dance professor, and we've been talking a lot about this idea of embodiment and bringing embodiment into the classroom in different ways, and how to talk about it, and how to recognize that the body is very much a part of who we are as humans, and therefore very much part of our learning. So I invite you to bring this, all the listeners, to talk about this very not yet topic, at least not yet to me, into a broader conversation.
Thanks for that. This is the time in the show that we do recommendations, and my recommendation is just a quick one, and it's from a former guest who has become a friend, Doug McKee from Yale. He and I were direct messaging each other back and forth on Twitter. I was having a little tough day, and I had stayed at work a long time to grade essays, and just thought, oh gosh, what are we doing? I felt pretty discouraged about where my students were at, and he wrote back, "Your job is to move them one step along a path. You can do that job no matter where they are when they enter your class." And I so needed to hear that. last night, and I hope some of you that resonates with you. We don't have to fix all of the challenges of learning in the educational system when we're teaching people who maybe aren't where they need to be at this stage in their education. We just have to move them one step along. And what is your recommendation for people today?
I'm reminded of, and partly because of the dance conversation we've had, I'm reminded of one of my favorite authors, Anne Lamott. She writes, I'm not recalling which book it's in. She writes about a situation where she had an opportunity to facilitate a course or a class for adults with different kinds of disabilities. And she said at the end of the class, a few of the participants of the class kind of said that they really appreciated her being there because she danced with them. And Anne Lamott writes, these are the words I want on the gravestone, that I was a helper and that I danced. And I think to kind of go along with your idea of kind of one step at a time, I think you're right that in many ways we get overwhelmed by the task of teaching. And sometimes if we think of ourselves as dancers, people who, maybe there is sometimes choreography, maybe sometimes it's free movement, but we're humans, and our dance is one of the things that we bring to a human interaction. And so I guess if we think about ourselves as bringing our humanity to the classroom and being willing to sometimes be vulnerable, which, dance often is vulnerable, sometimes to be choreographed and sometimes to be completely improvisational, and that's okay too. If we see ourselves as dancers, that might be a helpful metaphor for some of us who feel overwhelmed by teaching. So that you may be a dancer and that you may be a helper as teachers.
We have something else in common. Anne Lamott is also my favorite author.
That's great.
What a way to end. Thank you so much for being on Teaching in Higher Ed today. And I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation. And as you said, you've invited others into it as well. Thank you so much for being a guest.
You're very welcome, Bonnie. It's great to chat today.
Thanks once again to Dr. Amy Collier for being a guest on today's show. If you'd like to make any comments on the episode, and she's invited us in to start a conversation, please do so at teachinginhighered.com/70. As always, I would love to have your feedback. I'm getting so many great messages with ideas for the show and encouragement. You can do that at teachinginhighered.com/feedback. Would love to have you give a rating or a review on iTunes or whatever service it is you use to listen to the show so more people can discover it. That's the way those algorithms work, is to get your show up there and have more people become aware of it. Thanks in advance for doing that, and to all of those that have already written reviews. And lastly, if you have yet to subscribe to the weekly email, you'll get the Ed Tech Essentials Guide. All the show notes from every episode will come into your inbox only one time a week. And included will be an article about teaching or productivity. And that can be accessed at teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.